Settle in. Let your body find its weight against whatever is holding you right now. You do not need to remember anything tonight. You do not need to follow every detail or hold on to every name. If sleep finds you somewhere in the middle of this, that is exactly as it should be. The story will carry you. And the questions it carries have been waiting for a very long time already. They are patient questions. They can wait a little longer. Before we begin, I want to place a single image in your mind. Hold it gently and let it do its work. There is a spiral carved into a rock face in southern France. Simple. Clean. Turning inward on itself like a slow breath drawn in the dark. The people who carved it lived approximately 15,000 years ago. We do not know their names. We do not know what language they spoke. We do not know what they called the stars, or the river, or each other. There is a spiral carved into the entrance stone of a monument on the western coast of Ireland. It was carved approximately 5,000 years ago by people who had never heard of France, who had no way of knowing that anyone had ever reached for this same shape before them. There is a spiral pressed into volcanic rock on the island of Hawaii, made by people who crossed the largest ocean on Earth in wooden canoes, who lived on the opposite side of the planet from France and Ireland, who arrived on their island perhaps 1,000 years ago and reached for this same shape and pressed it into stone. No one is claiming tonight that these three cultures were connected. No one is saying there was a lost civilization that taught them all the same symbol. The honest answer is that we do not know why this keeps happening. We only know that it does. That something in the human mind, across 15,000 years and every ocean, reaches for the same shape when it wants to mark something that matters. That is where this story begins. Not with an answer, with a question quiet enough to carry you through the night. Before writing existed, human beings knew things, extraordinary things, things they kept alive for thousands of years without a single word written down. How did they do it? And how much of what they knew is still, somehow, reaching us? Chapter 1. The Problem with Silence. Here is the number that changes everything. Once you really let it settle. Among the oldest writing systems we have found anywhere on Earth are those that appeared approximately 5,000 years ago. Cuneiform marks pressed into clay tablets in ancient Sumer. In what is now southern Iraq. Hieroglyphic inscriptions from early dynastic Egypt. The oldest systems where marks on a surface represent sounds rather than objects appeared somewhere around 3000 BCE. Give or take a few centuries, depending on which tradition you are tracing and how you define the boundary between proto-writing and writing itself. 5,000 years. That sounds like a long time until you place it next to the other number. Modern human beings, people biologically identical to you and to everyone you have ever known, have been on this planet for at least 250,000 years. With some recent analyses of fossil remains suggesting the timeline may extend considerably further back than that. Remains found at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. With analysis published in the journal Nature in 2017 by a team led by Jean-Jacques Hublin of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, prompted debate about dates as early as 300,000 years or beyond. Though the precise interpretation of those findings continues to be discussed among specialists, take a moment with the arithmetic. If the full span of modern human existence were compressed into a single day of 24 hours, writing would appear in the final 24 minutes. Everything before that. Roughly 23 hours and 36 minutes of human life on this planet. Left no text, no inscription, no document we can open and read. The standard response to this, the response most of us absorbed somewhere in school without quite noticing we were absorbing it, is to treat those 23 hours and 36 minutes as a long and largely uneventful prelude. Hunter-gatherers moving across landscapes. Small groups. Simple tools. Waiting, in some vague sense, for history to begin. That response is not just incomplete. It is precisely backward. The people who lived before writing were not waiting for anything. They were doing what human beings do. They were learning things, passing things on, building systems of knowledge, sophisticated enough to survive for thousands of years across enormous distances under conditions that would have destroyed any system that was not carefully designed. They were solving the same problem that every civilization after them would face. The problem of how to keep what you know from disappearing when the person who knows it dies. They just solved it differently. And to understand their solutions, we first have to understand why the problem was so urgent. Because knowledge is not abstract. Knowledge does not float free of the people who hold it. Every piece of understanding a community depends on which plants are safe to eat, where the water is in the dry season, how to read the sky before a storm, what to do when a child stops breathing, how to navigate across open ocean with no landmarks in sight. Every one of those things lives inside a person. It was placed there by another person. And when the person who holds it dies without passing it on, it is gone. Not diminished. Not archived somewhere in reduced form. Gone. Think about what that means at the scale of a small community. A group of 40 or 60 people living in a landscape they depend on for everything. The oldest woman in the group knows which route. Prepared in a specific way at a specific time of year. Relieves the kind of fever that kills children. She learned it from the oldest woman before her. Who learned it from the oldest woman before her. That knowledge is perhaps 1,000 years old. It has saved lives in every generation. It has existed. She dies before she teaches it to anyone. The knowledge is gone. The children it would have saved will not be saved by it. And the loss is invisible. There is no grave for knowledge. There is no artifact that marks where it used to be. The community continues. Slightly more vulnerable than it was before. Without knowing exactly what it has lost. This is the central problem of pre-literate life. Not the danger of predators or the uncertainty of food. The central problem was this. How do you build a reliable system for keeping knowledge alive across generations when every single piece of that knowledge lives inside a human body that will not last more than a few decades? The answer. Developed over hundreds of thousands of years of trial and error by communities on every continent. Was not one system. It was several. And they are more sophisticated, more technically precise, and more durable than almost anyone raised in a literate culture has been taught to expect. But before we explore those systems, we need to clear away one more piece of the conventional story. Because the idea that pre-literate people were cognitively simpler than we are, less capable of abstract thought, less equipped for complex knowledge, is not just wrong. It is the opposite of what the evidence shows. The cognitive tools that modern humans carry, the capacity for language, for metaphor, for long-term planning, for constructing mental models of other people's minds, for organizing knowledge into systems. All of that was fully present long before the first word was written in clay. The archaeological record makes this clear in ways worth pausing on. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, dated to approximately 75,000 years ago, researchers have found pieces of ochre engraved with deliberate geometric patterns. Not random marks. Repeated. Structured. Intentional designs pressed into a medium by someone who understood that a surface could carry information beyond the moment of its making. The cave paintings at Chauvet in southern France, some dated to around 36,000 years ago, depict animals with an anatomical precision and a quality of movement that many professional artists today describe as astonishing. The people who made them understood perspective. They used the natural contours of the cave wall to give their figures the illusion of 3 dimensions. They thought carefully about how to make an image do something that the raw surface alone could not do. These were not simple people, waiting for civilization to begin. They had the same minds we have. They faced a harder version of the problem we face. And some of what they built to solve it has outlasted everything we thought was more permanent. The silence we perceive when we look back past the earliest writing is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of a different kind of storage. A kind that does not survive the way clay tablets survive. A kind that lives in other places entirely. What those places were. What was stored in them. And how much of it is still reaching us across the distance of all those years. Is what the rest of this night is for. Let your breathing slow. We are going back a long way. But we are not going into silence. We are going into a different kind of speaking. Chapter 2. The First Archive, the Human Body. In a museum in the city of Bolzano, in northern Italy, there is a man who has been dead for approximately 5,300 years. He was found in September of 1991 by two hikers crossing a glacier high in the Alps, on the border between Austria and Italy. The ice had preserved him so completely that when the hikers first saw him protruding from the melting glacier, they assumed he was a recent casualty, perhaps a climber who had died in the previous season. It took several days, and then several weeks of careful examination, before the full weight of what they had found became clear. He is known to the world as Ötzi. In the decades since his discovery, Ötzi has told researchers more about pre-literate knowledge systems than almost any other single find in the history of archaeology. Not because of his tools, though his tools are remarkable. Not because of his clothing, though the sophistication of his layered cold-weather gear surprised everyone who studied it. But because of what was on his skin. Ötzi had 61 tattoos. They were not placed where you might expect decoration to appear. They were not on his face or his hands or the parts of the body typically displayed. They were on his lower back, his ankles, his knees, his wrists, along his spine. Small marks, lines, and crosses, made by rubbing charcoal into fine incisions in the skin. Researchers who mapped the precise locations of those tattoos and compared them with traditional therapeutic systems from various cultures noticed something unexpected. A number of the locations correspond to points used in acupuncture-like therapeutic traditions, specifically to areas associated with the treatment of conditions that his skeletal remains suggest he was actually suffering from: degenerative joint disease in his knees and ankles, chronic lower back problems, the kind of persistent pain that would have been his constant companion in the final years of his life. Researchers have been careful about how they frame this. The correspondence does not prove that Ötzi or his community possessed anything like the formal acupuncture traditions of East Asia. What it may suggest, and what some scholars have proposed, is that the tattoos represent a therapeutic map of some kind. A record of treatment points carried on the body itself, placed exactly where they were needed. Impossible to leave behind or forget. Think about what that means as a knowledge system. A healer treating a patient does not need to remember which elder holds the relevant knowledge or travel to consult a distant specialist. The information is on the patient. It travels with them through every season and every migration and every year of their life. It is, in the most literal sense possible, knowledge that has become part of the person who needs it. This is not a workaround for the absence of writing. It is an elegant solution to a specific and difficult problem. How do you ensure that therapeutic knowledge is available at the exact moment it is needed, without any intermediary system that could be forgotten or lost? You put it on the person who needs it. Ötzi is one of the clearest examples we have of the human body functioning as an archive. But he is far from the only one. In the traditions of South Asia, a system of precise hand and finger gestures, known as mudras, has been used for thousands of years across meditation, classical dance, religious ritual, and therapeutic practice. The oldest textual references to mudra systems appear in Sanskrit literature dating back several thousand years. But within those traditions, the gestures themselves are understood to be far older than any written record of them. What makes mudras interesting as a knowledge system is their specificity. Each gesture is defined not just by the general shape of the hand, but by the exact placement of each finger, the degree of pressure at specific contact points, the angle of the wrist, the relationship between the gesture and the rhythm of the breath. This level of detail cannot be transmitted casually. It requires direct instruction from a practitioner who has already internalized it. Repeated practice until the gesture becomes automatic. And a community of people who share enough of the same understanding to recognize and correct errors when they appear. That is a sophisticated transmission system. It requires institutional structure. It requires people trained specifically to hold and pass on the knowledge. It requires a community that values the knowledge enough to sustain that structure across generations. What it does not require is paper. The knowledge lives in hands. In the muscle memory of thousands of practitioners who learned from practitioners, who learned from practitioners, in an unbroken chain that reaches back further than any document can trace. Now move from the body as a storage device to the body as a performance device. Because some of the most complex pre-literate knowledge systems were not encoded in marks or gestures, but in movement itself. Among the San people of southern Africa, there is a tradition of communal trance dance that researchers have studied for several decades. Genetic studies have found that San populations carry some of the deepest rooting lineages in the human family tree, reflecting a very ancient presence on the African continent. It is important to say clearly that genetic depth does not translate into any ranking of cultural sophistication or value. Every living culture is equally the product of its own long and complex history. What the genetic evidence tells us is simply that these communities have been here, on this continent, for a very long time. Their trance dance tradition involves extended communal movement, typically around a fire through an entire night. The dancers enter altered states of consciousness and describe experiences they understand as contact with forces beyond the ordinary world. Anthropologist David Lewis Williams, whose work on sandrock art is widely cited in the field, has proposed that imagery in sandrock paintings, some of which dates back tens of thousands of years, represents visions from these trance states and encodes cosmological knowledge in visual form. This interpretation remains debated among scholars and represents one framework among several, not an established consensus. What is less contested is this: the trance dance tradition functions as a system for transmitting a shared ecological and cosmological understanding across generations. The young learn by participating. The knowledge is not explained in lectures or written in manuals. It is experienced directly. And the experience itself is the transmission. This is what some researchers call embodied cognition. The knowledge does not exist separately from the act of knowing it. You cannot extract it and store it somewhere else. You learn it by doing it. And you keep it alive by doing it again. And you pass it on by bringing the next generation into the doing. It is fragile in one sense. If the dancing stops, the knowledge stops. There is no backup copy on any shelf. But it is extraordinarily robust in another sense. It does not depend on any material object. It cannot be burned or flooded or stolen. As long as people are alive and together and moving, it survives. Ötzi has been in Bolzano for more than 30 years now, and researchers still return to him with new questions and new tools. In recent years, new imaging analysis of his tattoos has produced fresh data about the depth and technique of their application. He keeps giving. The archive written on his skin has outlasted every library that existed when he was alive. Every single one. And somewhere in that fact, if you let yourself sit with it quietly for a moment, there is something that feels less like history and more like a message. From a man who died in a snowstorm 5,000 years ago, still carrying his knowledge on his skin, still waiting to be read. Thanks for watching. In the next chapter, we will follow that knowledge upward, from the skin of one man to the sky above every human community that has ever existed. where for most of human history, the most important library of all was written not in any material that could rot or burn, but in light. Chapter 3. Counting the Stars, Astronomical Language. In an Aboriginal Australian community, somewhere in what is now the state of Victoria, there is a tradition about the sky that researchers have spent years trying to understand properly. The tradition does not belong to a single named individual. It belongs to a community. It has been held and passed forward by that community across more generations than anyone can count. And what astronomer Duane Hamacher, working closely with Aboriginal community members and knowledge holders over many years, has documented in some of these traditions is something that took the broader research community time to fully absorb. Specific star clusters function as precise seasonal calendars. When a certain constellation reaches a certain angle on the eastern horizon before dawn, it is time to look for a specific food source. When a particular star rises in a particular position, a specific animal is moving. A specific plant is flowering. A specific ecological event is underway. The correspondences between these astronomical markers and the ecological events they predict have been verified against biological data in a number of cases. They are not purely symbolic. They carry functional ecological information. Think about what that accuracy requires. It requires sustained observation over many generations. It requires a community that decided these correspondences were important enough to encode carefully. It requires a transmission system robust enough to carry specific details without distortion across the centuries needed to test and refine the knowledge. And it requires, perhaps most of all, a decision about form. A decision about what shape to give the knowledge so that it would survive the one thing no community can prevent: the death of the people who hold it. The answer that communities in Australia and elsewhere around the world arrived at independently was to give the knowledge the shape of a story. Not because stories are easier to remember than facts, though they often are, but because a story embedded in ceremony, required to be told in a specific form, checked against the tellings of other practitioners, and understood by its community as carrying real information about the real world, behaves very differently from a casual account. It resists the drift that ordinary memory is subject to. It holds its shape. The sky was the ideal subject for this kind of encoding. Every community on Earth, at every point in history, has needed to know where it is in time, which season is approaching, when the rains will arrive, when to plant, when to move, when to prepare. The sky answers all of those questions, reliably, repeatedly, year after year, with a precision that no other available system could match. And so, communities on every continent develop systems for reading that answer and keeping what they read. On a dried lake bed in the Nubian desert of what is now southern Sudan, approximately 500 kilometers south of Cairo, there is a site called Nabta Playa. It is one of several ancient sites around the world where researchers have proposed astronomical alignments in stone arrangements, though it is among the oldest and most studied. Between roughly 9,000 and 5,000 years ago, it was a seasonal lake surrounded by grassland where people camped, herded cattle, and returned year after year across generations. They left behind traces of fires and meals and sustained habitation. And they left behind stones. Large stones, some weighing several hundred kilograms, arranged into. One arrangement in particular has drawn the attention of researchers since the site was first systematically studied in the 1990s. A circle of stones, older than Stonehenge by several thousand years. Researchers, including J. McKim Malville and colleagues, have proposed that the alignment of certain stones may correspond to the position of the rising sun at the summer solstice, which in this region would have marked the beginning of the rainy season. The researchers note that interpretations of the site are still debated and that not all proposed alignments have been accepted without question by the broader scholarly community. but the basic point stands regardless of how precisely the astronomical functions are calibrated. Someone at Nabta Playa, 6 to 7,000 years ago, looked at the sky, identified a pattern, decided that pattern was important enough to mark permanently in the landscape, and organized enough communal effort to make that marking possible. That is not a simple act. That is the act of a community that has been watching the sky long enough to understand which patterns repeat reliably. A community with a shared vocabulary for talking about what they see. A community that has made a decision to externalize their knowledge. To take something that existed in the minds of skilled observers and press it into the earth itself so that the knowledge would outlast the observers. That decision, the decision to externalize knowledge into a form that persists beyond any individual life, is the decision that eventually leads to writing. But writing was a late arrival. Long before it appeared, communities were externalizing knowledge into the one medium available everywhere, visible to everyone, and renewed every single night without any maintenance required. The sky. Consider what the night sky offered a pre-literate community that most of us in the modern world have lost almost entirely. In a landscape without artificial light, on a clear night, the human eye can see somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 individual stars. The Milky Way is not a faint suggestion at the edge of perception. It is a vivid, structured, three-dimensional presence overhead. The movement of stars across the sky through the night, and the slow shift of constellations across the seasons, creates a clock and a calendar of extraordinary precision. This is not metaphor. The sky is a literal clock. The rising of specific stars at specific points on the horizon, at specific times of night, corresponds to specific seasons, specific weather patterns, specific ecological events, with a regularity that can be relied upon across centuries. Communities that learn to read those correspondences possess something of enormous value. A system of knowledge that was free, universally available, and could not be destroyed. On the other side of the world, in the island groups of the Central and Eastern Pacific, a different civilization developed a different, but structurally parallel relationship with the sky. The Polynesian navigators who settled Hawaii, New Zealand, Easter Island, and dozens of other Pacific islands between roughly 1000 and 1300 CE performed what some researchers have described as one of the greatest feats of exploration in human history. They crossed thousands of miles of open ocean in wooden canoes, finding islands invisible below the horizon, without any of the instruments that European sailors of the 18th century would have considered essential. They did it by reading the sky and the sea simultaneously. Polynesian navigational traditions, documented most thoroughly in the Caroline Islands of Micronesia, where some practitioners maintained the knowledge into the 20th century, involve memorizing the rising and setting points of hundreds of individual stars. The horizon is understood as a compass, divided into named positions corresponding to specific stars. A navigator who knows which star rises at which position can determine direction with great precision, even in the middle of a featureless ocean at night. But the stars were only one layer. These navigators also integrated wave patterns and how they are disturbed by distant land. The flight paths of specific bird species that travel predictable distances from shore. Cloud formations that develop over islands due to the heating of the land surface. The color and temperature of the water. A Polynesian navigator held all of this simultaneously, updating it continuously throughout a voyage that might last weeks, using each stream of information to refine a continuously updated sense of position in an ocean the size of half the planet. This was not navigation as a set of techniques. It was a living knowledge system, running in a human mind, integrating multiple independent streams of information into something that no instrument of the time could replicate, and it was transmitted entirely without writing. The sky traditions of Aboriginal Australia and the star knowledge of the Polynesian navigators and the stone arrangements at Nabta Playa are not expressions of the same tradition. They arose independently, in different environments, by different communities with different needs. What they share is a recognition of the same deep fact. For many communities throughout human history, the sky became one of the first shared libraries, open to everyone, never closed, endlessly legible to those who had been taught to read it. The library is still there tonight, above you. Most of us have simply forgotten how to look. And in the forgetting, we have lost something that the next chapter will try to help us see again. Something about the shapes that human beings have always reached for when they want to mark what the sky, and everything beneath it, makes them feel. Chapter 4. The Shape That Keeps Returning. There is a woman in a small boat somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. Perhaps 800 years ago. She has been at sea for 11 days. She is tired in the way that open ocean travel makes you tired. Not just in the body, but somewhere deeper. In the part of the mind that keeps track of where you are in the world. The island she left is long gone below the horizon behind her. The island she is sailing toward is not yet visible ahead. She is not lost. She knows exactly where she is. She knows it from the angle of the swell beneath the hull, from the star that rose at a specific point on the horizon 2 hours before dawn, from the behavior of a bird she watched for 20 minutes at midday. She knows it the way a person who has spent years learning to read a landscape knows where they are in it. Not from a map, but from everything the landscape is telling them at once. When she arrives at her destination and steps ashore and walks up from the beach to the place where her community makes its marks in the volcanic rock, she will press a spiral into the stone. She will not know that someone 15,000 years ago in a cave in France pressed the same shape into a wall. She will not know about the stone monument in Ireland where the same spiral turns across the entrance stone. She will know only that this shape, turning inward on itself, means something that the other shapes do not mean. Something about cycles, about return, about the way a voyage out becomes a voyage home. And she will press it into the rock and walk away. And it will still be there 1,000 years later when researchers begin to ask why this shape appears in so many places that should have had no knowledge of each other. In 2019, a team of researchers published findings in the journal Nature that quietly shifted the timeline of human artistic expression. They had been working in the Maros Pangkep karst region of Sulawesi, Indonesia, applying uranium series dating to calcium carbonate deposits formed over ancient cave paintings. Some of the figurative art came back at 45,000 years old, making it among the oldest known representational painting on Earth. And on one wall, there were hand stencils, human hands pressed against stone, pigment blown around them to leave a negative image. The outline of a hand reaching toward us across 45,000 years. In southern France, at sites including Chauvet and Pec Merle, there are hand stencils made by people who lived tens of thousands of years ago on the other side of the planet. Same gesture, same technique, same impulse to press the most intimate available object against a surface and leave a mark that would outlast the moment. Nobody claims these two acts were connected. What the similarity points toward is something different and more interesting than any theory of ancient connection could offer. It points toward what happens when a human mind, anywhere on Earth, in any era, confronts a blank surface and a supply of pigment. It reaches for the hand, the thing that made the mark, marking itself. Hold that thought as we look at what happens when you survey the visual record of pre-literate cultures around the world and ask whether certain shapes appear with unusual frequency across cultures that had no documented contact. The answer is yes. And the shapes that appear most consistently are a small set. The spiral, concentric circles, the chevron, which is a repeated V shape arranged in rows or nested inside each other. The dot within a circle, the grid. At Newgrange in Ireland, a passage tomb built approximately 5,200 years ago. The entrance stone is covered in spirals, carved with a precision that required sustained effort and clear intention. At Göbekli Tepe, in southeastern Turkey, built approximately 12,000 years ago, and currently the oldest large stone structure found anywhere on Earth. Carved pillars carry abstract symbols alongside detailed animal imagery. In the petroglyphs of Hawaii, pressed into volcanic rock by the ancestors of the woman in our small boat, spirals appear alongside human figures and geometric forms. In the ceramic art of the Cucuteni Tripilia culture of what is now Romania and Ukraine, which flourished between roughly 5,500 and 2,750 BCE, spirals decorate bowls and figurines with a consistency that speaks of deep cultural significance. These are not the same symbols, carrying the same meaning across all these cultures. What they are is a set of visual forms appearing repeatedly across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, in contexts that suggest they were understood as meaningful rather than decorative. What do we do with this? There are two serious scholarly frameworks, and it is worth presenting both honestly because neither has definitively settled the question. The first framework is called cognitive universalism. Its core claim is that the human brain, regardless of cultural context, tends to generate certain visual forms under certain conditions. Research on what neurologists call entoptic phenomena, visual experiences generated by the nervous system itself during altered states, extreme fatigue, high fever, or certain meditative states, has shown that the human visual system reliably produces a small recurring set of forms, spirals, grids, concentric circles, nested curves. Neuroscientist and rock art researcher David Lewis Williams developed an influential framework proposing that many geometric forms in prehistoric rock art around the world reflect these internally generated visual experiences. On this account, the spiral at Newgrange and the spiral in the Hawaiian petroglyph field look similar, not because they share a common source, but because they share a common generator: the human nervous system, doing what human nervous systems do everywhere on Earth. The second framework focuses on population history. All living human populations descend from groups that migrated out of Africa, beginning somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 years ago. Those founding populations carried with them not just biology, but culture, including visual traditions and ways of making marks on surfaces. Some similarities across widely separated cultures may reflect a shared inheritance from those founding populations. A visual vocabulary transformed almost beyond recognition over tens of thousands of years, but preserving certain fundamental forms because of their neurological basis or their usefulness for specific purposes. These two frameworks are not in competition. A spiral might simultaneously be a form the human nervous system tends to generate, and a form that was part of an inherited visual vocabulary carried out of Africa. The two explanations reinforce each other. What neither framework supports is the idea that the similarities prove a single lost civilization that taught these symbols to everyone. Claims about lost ancient teachers go beyond what the evidence warrants and tend to obscure the more interesting story, which is what the similarities reveal about the shared architecture of human cognition. Because here is what the cognitive universalist framework actually implies, if you follow it to its conclusion. If the human brain reliably generates certain visual forms under certain conditions, and if cultures around the world have independently recognized those forms and decided they were worth pressing into stone, then those forms were doing something. They were not arbitrary decoration. They were meaningful in a way that crossed cultural context. The woman in her small boat, pressing a spiral into volcanic rock, and the person at Newgrange 5,000 years ago, and the artist in a cave in France 15,000 years ago, are not saying the same thing. They are not speaking the same language or worshipping the same gods. But they may have been reaching for the same register of experience. The place where ordinary boundaries dissolve, where something feels larger than the moment containing it. where time folds back on itself like a wave returning to the sea it came from. That is not a trivial observation. That is one of the most consistent features of human experience across every culture and every century we have any record of. And the shape that keeps returning, the spiral turning inward on itself, like a slow breath, may be the oldest surviving record of human beings trying to mark that experience in a form that would outlast the marking. Not proof of a shared language, evidence of a shared humanity, which is, in the end, the more astonishing thing to find. Chapter 5. Memory Palaces Made of Landscape. There is a geologist named Patrick Nunn who spent years doing what geologists do: measuring coastlines, reading sediment layers, dating the slow transformations of land and water across thousands of years. He was not, initially, interested in oral tradition. He was interested in rock. Then something happened that changed the direction of his work. He began listening more carefully to the stories that Aboriginal Australian communities told about specific places in the landscape. Not as mythology, not as metaphor, as potential data. What he found, documented in research published with linguist Nicholas Reid in the journal Australian Geographer in 2016, was that certain oral traditions appeared to describe real physical events with a geographic precision that could be cross-referenced against the geological record. Traditions describing coastlines that had been submerged, valleys that had once held water, islands that no longer existed. Some of the events these traditions appeared to describe had occurred, according to independent geological dating, somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago. Nunn and Reid were careful about their framing. They described their findings as evidence that oral traditions can preserve accurate information about real events across very long time spans under specific conditions. Not as proof that all oral traditions are historically literal. The conditions matter enormously. And one of the most important conditions, they found, was this: the traditions that appear to carry accurate long-term memory are not casual stories. They are formal knowledge systems, embedded in ceremony, transmitted through trained practitioners, and understood by their communities as carrying real information about the real world. Hold that finding in mind as we look at the most sophisticated example of landscape-based knowledge storage that has been documented anywhere on Earth: the songlines. The Aboriginal Australian concept of the songlines, sometimes called dreaming tracks, is genuinely difficult to describe in terms that a Western conceptual framework can receive accurately. It operates simultaneously on several levels that literate traditions tend to keep separate. It is cosmology and geography and law and history and navigation and natural history, all encoded in a single, integrated system that has probably been in continuous use for tens of thousands of years. The basic structure is this. Across the Australian continent, there are paths, invisible paths, understood as the routes traveled by ancestral beings in the time of creation. As those beings moved through the landscape, they sang, and as they sang, the features of the landscape came into being. The hills, the water sources, the distinctive rock formations, the patterns of seasonal change. Each songline is both a path through a physical landscape and a sequence of songs that encode information about that landscape. To travel, the songline is to sing it, and to sing it correctly is to navigate it accurately. The songs contain information about water sources, edible plants, dangerous terrain, seasonal resources, and the locations of sites that carry particular significance. They also encode genealogical information, legal information about the rights and responsibilities of different groups in different territories, and information about the relationship between human life and the patterns of the natural world. A person who knows a songline fully can travel hundreds of miles through country. They have never physically visited by following the sequence of songs and reading the landscape features. the songs describe. This has been documented by researchers, including anthropologist Deborah Bird Rose and ethnomusicologist Stephen Wild, among others, who have worked with Aboriginal communities to understand the structure and function of songline knowledge. The picture that emerges is of a knowledge system of extraordinary scope, one that integrates ecological, geographical, legal, historical, and cosmological information into a single mnemonic architecture using the landscape itself as its organizing structure. The landscape is the library. The songs are the index. A trained practitioner is a reader who can navigate the collection. Now travel to the other side of the Pacific Ocean and move several centuries into the past. In the Andes Mountains of South America, the civilization we know as the Inca developed a different but structurally comparable system for encoding knowledge in landscape. From the city of Cusco, which the Inca understood as the center of the world, 41 lines radiated outward across the surrounding territory. These lines, called sikhs, were not physical roads, though some corresponded to paths that could be walked. They were conceptual lines, organizing principles that divided the territory around Cusco into sectors, each associated with a specific social group, a specific set of ritual obligations, and a specific sequence of sacred sites called wakas. Researcher Brian Bauer of the University of Illinois, whose work on the Sikh system is among the most detailed available, has documented that the system encoded simultaneously a calendrical cycle, a system of land rights and water management, a schedule of religious ceremonies, and a record of ancestral lineages. Different social groups were responsible for different Sikhs and the wakas along them, meaning that the maintenance of the sacred geography was distributed across the entire society. No single group held all the knowledge. No single loss could destroy the whole. The system worked as an archive because the landscape was the storage medium. The wakas, physical features of the terrain, both natural and constructed, were the memory nodes. The ritual obligations that required different groups to visit specific wakas on specific schedules ensured that the information was regularly rehearsed and that any degradation in the knowledge would be noticed by the community as a whole. It was a distributed memory system using the physical world as its hardware and human beings moving through that world as its operating system. Now, consider these two systems alongside each other, the songlines and the Sikh system, and alongside the astronomical knowledge we explored in the previous chapter, and a pattern begins to emerge that says something important about how knowledge survives. Pre-literate knowledge systems that endured across very long time spans shared certain structural features. They distributed knowledge across a community rather than concentrating it in a small number of individuals. They embedded knowledge in formal contexts that created social obligations to maintain it accurately. They used the physical world as an external storage medium, encoding information in landscape features that persisted across generations. And they integrated different domains of knowledge into single unified systems, so that ecological and historical and legal and cosmological knowledge were not separate archives but parts of a single, interconnected whole. These are not the design features of a system struggling to compensate for the absence of writing. They are the design features of a system refined over thousands of years of practice to solve a specific and difficult problem. How do you keep complex knowledge alive across centuries in a world where no material medium can be relied upon to last? You put the knowledge in the world itself. You build a community around it. You make the maintenance of the knowledge a social and spiritual obligation that no individual can opt out of. And you structure it so that the knowledge is not held in any one place or any one mind, but distributed across the entire living network of people and places that together constitute a culture. Writing, when it eventually arrived, solved problems these systems could not solve. It allowed knowledge to reach people who were not present when it was created. It allowed more information to be stored than any community of minds could hold. It allowed precise language to be preserved in a way that oral transmission, however formal, cannot guarantee. But writing also introduced vulnerabilities that these older systems did not have. A tablet can be smashed. A library can be burned. A tradition of literacy can disappear within a generation when the social conditions that sustained it collapse. As we will see in later chapters, the landscape does not burn in the same way. The stars do not go dark when a city falls. The songlines survived the arrival of European colonizers, even as the communities that held them were devastated, because the knowledge was not stored in any building or any object that could be taken or destroyed. It was stored in the land itself, and in the relationship between the land and the people who knew how to read it. Patrick Nunn is still working, still listening to the stories, still cross-referencing them against the rock. And the landscape, patient as it has always been, is still giving answers to anyone willing to ask the right questions in the right way. In the next chapter, we will leave the landscape and pick up a different kind of record entirely. One you could hold in your hands. One made not of stone or song but of string. Knotted in ways that may have carried far more than anyone realized until a package of photographs arrived on a desk in Scotland in 2017. Chapter 6. Knots, Strings, and the Other Writing. In the spring of 2017, a small package arrived at the desk of a researcher at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Her name was Sabine Hyland, and she had spent years working on one of the most persistent, unsolved puzzles in the archaeology of the Americas. The package contained photographs of an object held in a private collection in the Peruvian highlands. The object was a quipu, and from the moment she began examining the photographs, she knew it was unlike any quipu she had seen before. If you have not encountered the word, a quipu is a device made of cotton or wool cord, a main horizontal string from which hang dozens or sometimes hundreds of smaller pendant strings. Those pendant strings can have smaller strings hanging from them, and those can have smaller strings still, creating a branching hierarchical structure that can become remarkably complex. Along the strings, at varying positions and in varying configurations, are knots. Different types of knots, different numbers of knots, knots placed at different distances from each other, colors that vary across the strings in patterns that appear systematic. For most of the 20th century, the academic consensus held that quipus were primarily numerical recording devices. The Inca used them to keep census records, to track tribute payments, to manage the logistics of an empire that stretched 4,000 kilometers along the spine of the Andes and governed a population of somewhere between 6 and 12 million people. The knot types and positions encoded numbers in a base 10 system that researchers had worked out with reasonable confidence. Quipus, on this view, were sophisticated abacuses made of string. Sabine Hyland was not convinced the story was complete. Most quipus that have survived are relatively simple in structure, 75, with a limited number of string colors and knot types. The object in those photographs was different. It had a level of internal complexity. In the variation of its cord construction, the twist, direction of the fibers, the combination of colors achieved by plying together strands of different hues that went well beyond what would be needed for a numerical recording system alone. Hyland analyzed the object using a framework she had been developing for several years, looking at the quipu not only as a numerical device but as a potential sign system. She identified 24 distinct chord types in this single quipu, based on variations in color, fiber, ply direction, and attachment style. 24 distinct signs is a number consistent with a syllabic writing system, where each sign represents a syllable rather than a word or a sound. Her analysis, published in the journal Current Anthropology in 2017, proposed that this quipu might encode phonetic information. Specifically, that the physical properties of each chord might correspond to syllables in the Quechua language spoken by the Inca. Hyland was precise about the status of her finding. She described it as evidence suggesting the possibility of phonetic encoding, not as proof that the entire quipu system was a full writing system. The sample size was small. The decipherment was partial. Further research would be needed before any stronger conclusions could be drawn. But the implication was significant. If even some quipus encoded phonetic information, the Inca may have possessed something closer to a complete writing system than anyone had previously believed. The administrative quipus that survive in museum collections around the world, understood for decades as purely numerical, might be only one variety of a much broader recording technology, whose full range we have not yet grasped. Sabine Hyland is still working on this question. The answer is not yet in. But the question itself, opened by a package of photographs sent to a desk in Scotland, has already changed how researchers think about what a writing system can be. Because the quipu is the most thoroughly documented example of a non-visual, non-linear recording system from any culture anywhere in the world, and it is not the only one. When you look at the others, a pattern emerges that challenges one of the deepest assumptions in the history of information. The assumption is this: writing, meaning the encoding of language in a permanent visual medium, is the only system that can carry complex information reliably across time and distance. Everything else is a workaround, a preliminary, a less capable substitute for the real thing. The quipu challenges that assumption not by being writing in disguise, but by demonstrating that a non-visual, tactile, the structural system can encode enough information to manage the logistics of one of the largest empires in the pre-modern world. Whatever the quipu was doing, it was doing it well enough to hold together a state that controlled a territory larger than the Roman Empire at its height, across some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. The wampum belts of the Haudenosaunee, the Confederation of Nations in northeastern North America, sometimes called the Iroquois, operated on a different principle but toward comparable ends. Wampum are small cylindrical beads, traditionally made from shells, woven into belts in patterns of white and purple that carry meaning through the arrangement of colors and the context in which each belt was created and exchanged. The belts were used to record agreements between nations, to mark significant diplomatic events, to encode the terms of treaties and alliances, and to carry messages across distances too great for a single messenger to travel safely without a physical token of authentication. Each belt was understood by the communities that made and received it as a record, something that could be produced in a formal context to demonstrate the terms of an agreement or the history of a relationship. Trained readers could interpret the content of a belt from its patterns, but the full meaning also depended on the oral tradition associated with it, the account of what had happened when it was made, what it had been used to record. This combination of physical object and oral tradition is a feature shared by many pre-literate recording systems, and it represents a fundamentally different model of what a record is. In the literate tradition we have inherited, a record is meant to be self-contained. The document carries its meaning within itself. A reader with the right linguistic knowledge can interpret it without any additional context. That self-containedness is one of writing's great advantages, but it is also a vulnerability. A document separated from the community that produced it becomes opaque to anyone without the cultural context to read it, and a tradition of literacy that is interrupted leaves behind documents that cannot speak to the people who find them, as we will see in later chapters. The wampum belt and the quipu are not self-contained in that way. They require a community of practitioners to be fully readable, but that dependence on community is also a form of resilience. The meaning is held in the community, not in the object alone. The object and the community together constitute the record. At the site of Carroll, in the Supe Valley of coastal Peru, radiocarbon dating suggests occupation beginning around 2600 BCE, give or take several decades. making it one of the oldest urban centers identified in the Americas. Ruth Shady Solis and her team found among the ruins of a temple there a textile piece that appeared to be a quipu. If the identification and the dating hold under further analysis, this would push the origin of the quipu tradition back more than 4,000 years before the Inca, suggesting that the technology was not an Inca invention, but the culmination of a tradition that had been developing in the Andes for millennia. That timeline connects two researchers whose names have appeared in this story. Ruth Shady Solis, working in the dust of the Supe Valley, asking how old the tradition of Andean recording actually is. Sabine Hyland, opening a package of photographs in Scotland, asking how much that tradition could carry. Between them, the full question takes shape. Not just what a quipu is, but what it was always capable of being. String may have done for the Andes what clay did for Mesopotamia, not as a lesser substitute, as a different solution to the same problem, evolved in a different environment, with different available materials and different structural needs. Sabine Hyland is still counting knots. Ruth Shady Solis is still reading the ground at Carroll. And the thread between them, the question of how much human beings figured out how to carry in a length of knotted cord, is still being followed. In the next chapter, we will look at a different kind of knowledge carrier entirely. Not an object you hold in your hands, but a voice. And at the question of how much that voice could carry across time, and how far, if the conditions were exactly right. Chapter 7. The oral tradition is not primitive. There is a particular kind of condescension that runs through the history of how literate cultures have thought about oral ones. It rarely announces itself as condescension. It tends to appear instead as a kind of gentle sympathy, a regret that these cultures did not develop the tools to preserve their knowledge properly. The implication, rarely stated directly, but present throughout, is that oral tradition is a fragile and slowly degrading form of transmission that does its best but cannot match the precision and durability of the written word. That implication is wrong, and the place to begin understanding why it is wrong is with a specific case that has been studied in enough detail to make the argument concrete. Imagine for a moment that you are standing in a village somewhere in what is now the Gambia. The year is sometime in the 18th century. A ceremony is underway. At its center is a man who has been training for this role since childhood. He is perhaps 40 years old. He has spent 3 decades memorizing, rehearsing, and performing a body of knowledge so large it would fill several volumes if written down. He is a griot. The griot tradition of West Africa spans a broad belt of cultures from Senegal to Mali to Guinea and beyond. Griots are professional oral historians and musicians whose role is defined entirely by their responsibility for knowledge. Not knowledge in general. Specific knowledge. The dynastic histories of ruling families. Genealogies, tracking lineages across dozens of generations. The histories of wars, alliance, migrations, and political transformations. The biographies of significant individuals. The circumstances of important agreements and their terms. A griot's training begins in childhood and continues for decades, and the knowledge they hold is not stored as a single continuous narrative. It is organized in ways that allow a griot to produce the relevant section for any given occasion. Genealogical information at a naming ceremony. Dynastic history at a royal event. The history of a particular lineage when a dispute over inheritance requires it. Researcher Thomas Hale of Pennsylvania State University, whose work on griot traditions is among the most comprehensive available, has documented cases where griot accounts of historical events appear to correspond with reasonable accuracy to evidence from other sources, including Arabic written records from the medieval period. It is worth noting that griot traditions vary considerably across communities and are not uniformly verifiable in this way. What the documented cases show is that these traditions can function as reliable knowledge systems under the right conditions. Not that all oral history is equally precise or consistent. What makes griot knowledge robust across such long time spans? Several things work together in a way worth examining carefully. Because the structure reveals something important about how oral transmission can be designed for durability. The knowledge is held by specialists whose entire social identity is defined by their responsibility for it. Their livelihood and their standing depend entirely on the quality and accuracy of what they hold. That creates a powerful incentive for precision that casual transmission does not have. The knowledge is publicly performed regularly in contexts where errors would be noticed. A griot who misrepresents the genealogy of a ruling family in a ceremony attended by members of that family is not making an abstract mistake. The public performance context creates a checking mechanism that private records do not automatically provide. The knowledge is held redundantly. Different griots within a community hold overlapping portions of the same tradition. Discrepancies between their accounts are noticed and resolved. The tradition is not stored in a single mind that could be lost irreparably. It is distributed across a community of practitioners in a way that provides resilience against individual failure. These are structural features, design elements. They suggest that communities using oral tradition as their primary knowledge storage technology understood the failure modes of that technology and built in mechanisms to address them. Now consider what happened when Patrick Nunn, whose landscape research we explored in Chapter 5, applied similar thinking to a different category of oral tradition. Nunn and linguist Nicholas Reed examined Aboriginal Australian traditions that described specific geographic features no longer present in the landscape: coastlines that had been submerged, valleys that had once held water, islands that had disappeared. Some of the events these traditions appeared to describe had occurred. According to independent geological dating, between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago, the traditions that appeared to carry this long-term geographic memory shared the structural features we identified in the griot tradition. They were formal, not casual. They were embedded in ceremony. They were transmitted through trained practitioners who understood them as carrying real information. And they were performed in contexts where the community could collectively hold the knowledge accountable. 7,000 to 10,000 years. Let that number sit for a moment. Among the oldest surviving written records we have are those approximately 5,000 years old. The oral traditions Nunn and Reed examined appear to preserve accurate information about events that occurred before writing existed anywhere on Earth. Nunn and Reed do not claim certainty. They describe their findings as suggestive, as evidence that opens a question rather than closes it. But the question they have opened is one that the dismissive view of oral tradition cannot accommodate. If formal oral traditions embedded in ceremony and transmitted through trained practitioners can preserve accurate geographic memory across 10,000 years, then what else might be preserved in traditions we have not yet examined carefully enough? We do not yet know the full answer to that question. But the assumptions we started with were wrong. And the corrections to those assumptions point toward something genuinely surprising about what the human mind, properly supported by community and structure and the weight of social obligation, can hold. The griot in the Gambia and the knowledge holder in Aboriginal Australia are practicing different traditions in different languages on opposite sides of the world. But they are doing the same fundamental thing. They are being the library. Not keeping a library. Being it. And the library, when it is built this way, turns out to be harder to destroy than any building that has ever housed books. As long as the people who carry it are alive. And as long as the world around them lets them keep singing. Now here is the question that follows from everything we have just explored. If oral tradition can carry knowledge about the world across 10,000 years with genuine accuracy, then what might it have preserved about the most dramatic transformation the world has undergone in all of that time? What might communities who watched the coastlines of their world disappear beneath rising water have built into the stories their children carried forward? That question is where we are going next. Chapter 8. When the water rose, Start with the geology, not with the mythology, not with the ancient texts, with the physical evidence in rock and sediment and ice cores, because that evidence is where this chapter has to be anchored, if it is going to be honest about what we know and what we do not know. At the peak of the last ice age, approximately 20,000 years ago, sea levels around the world were roughly 120 meters lower than they are today. That is not a small difference. That is the difference between a coastline and a continent. Vast territories that are now underwater were then dry land. The continental shelf of Southeast Asia, a region researchers call Sundaland, connected what are now the islands of Java, Sumatra, and Borneo into a single landmass larger than the Indian subcontinent. The shallow seas between Siberia and Alaska were dry. A broad plain called Beringia that served as the corridor through which the ancestors of all Native American peoples walked into the Americas. The North Sea between Britain and continental Europe was a landscape of marshes and forests and slow-moving rivers. Home to communities of hunter-gatherers we will meet in the next chapter. As the ice began to retreat, starting around 18,000 years ago, that land began to disappear. The process was not uniform and it was not slow in any human sense. It came in pulses, driven by the episodic collapse of ice sheets. Each collapse sending enormous volumes of meltwater into the ocean and raising sea levels by meters over periods of decades or centuries. For the communities living on those coastal landscapes, the experience was not the experience of geological change happening somewhere beyond human perception. It was the experience of watching your world shrink within a single lifetime. Fishing grounds your father knew were gone. Camps your grandmother had used were underwater. The stories you had been told about the landscape no longer matched the landscape you could see. The single most dramatic event in this long process of inundation occurred around 8,200 years ago, off the coast of what is now Norway. At the edge of the Norwegian continental shelf, an enormous area of seafloor sediment destabilized and slid into the deep ocean. The event is called the Storegga Slide, and it is one of the largest underwater landslides documented in the geological record of the current period of Earth history. The tsunami it generated has been reconstructed by researchers using the physical deposits it left behind. On the eastern coast of Scotland, geological surveys have identified a layer of marine sediment far above any normal tidal level, dating precisely to the period of the Storegga Slide, left there by waves that researchers estimate reached heights of at least 20 meters in some locations. Similar deposits have been found in the Faroe Islands, along the Norwegian coast, and in Greenland. For any communities living on the low-lying coastal plains of northern Europe at that moment, the event would have been catastrophic and, without warning. This is established geology. The Storegga Slide happened. The tsunami happened. The sea level rise of the post-glacial period happened. These events are documented in the physical record with the same kind of evidence used to establish any other geological fact. Now we come to the part that requires more care. Across the world, in cultures that had no documented contact with each other and no shared written tradition from which they could have borrowed, there are stories about a great flood, a flood that destroyed a former world, a flood from which a small number of survivors escaped, often through some form of warning, often by means of a boat or a high place, often carrying with them the seeds of a renewed world. The similarities between some of these traditions are real and have been noted by scholars for a long time. When the Epic of Gilgamesh was first translated from cuneiform tablets found at Nineveh in what is now northern Iraq in the 19th century, the parallels with the biblical story of Noah were immediately apparent. But flood traditions appear far beyond the ancient Near East. They can be found in oral traditions of cultures across the Americas, the Pacific, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South and Southeast Asia. What do we do with this? The answer requires holding two things in mind simultaneously and resisting the pull toward either of the two easy positions available. The first easy position holds that the worldwide distribution of flood traditions is evidence of a single historical global flood that all of these traditions are independently remembering. This position is not supported by the geological evidence. There was no global flood in the period of modern human habitation of Earth. The geological record does not support a single catastrophic inundation of the entire planet within the last 100,000 years. The second easy position holds that flood traditions are simply a universal narrative archetype. Floods are common and frightening experiences. Human minds tend to generate certain narrative shapes when processing catastrophic loss. The similarities between traditions from different cultures reflect nothing more historically significant than the universality of floods as a natural phenomenon and certain tendencies in human storytelling. This second position may also be incomplete, because here is what Patrick Nunn's research suggests. When applied to flood traditions specifically, if oral traditions embedded in formal ceremonial contexts can preserve accurate memories of real geological events across thousands of years, then it seems reasonable to ask whether some flood traditions around the world might preserve memories of real flooding events. Specifically, the dramatic sea level rises and coastal inundations of the post-glacial period. Not a single global flood. Not one event that all traditions remember in different forms, but a period of genuine environmental catastrophe lasting thousands of years, during which coastlines around the world were swallowed by rising seas, and in which the memory of that loss was shaped into the forms that oral tradition uses to carry things across long distances of time. This is a hypothesis being explored by researchers, not a settled conclusion. None of the specific connections proposed between oral traditions and geological events have been proven to the satisfaction of all specialists. What can be said with confidence is that the communities living on post-glacial coastlines experienced real catastrophic flooding. Those people had oral traditions. Some of those traditions survived. Whether and how the flooding shaped those traditions is a question that deserves more careful examination than it has generally received. The flood traditions of the world are not all remembering the same event. Some are almost certainly archetypal narratives that tell us about human psychology and the shapes that grief takes. But some of them may also be doing something else. Carrying, in the form that oral tradition uses to carry things across long time. A real memory of a real world that was swallowed by the sea. Think for a moment about the people who lived on those coastlines, who watched the water rise, who told their children what had been lost, who shaped the memory of catastrophe into a story durable enough to outlast the catastrophe itself. They did not know that anyone would ever try to verify their stories against the geology. They only knew that what had happened needed to be remembered. And so, they built it into the most durable thing they had. A story shaped to last. And in the next chapter, we will look at what happens when the people who carry those stories, and all the other kinds of knowledge we have been tracing tonight, are taken from the world before they have been able to pass them on. Chapter 9. What was lost and what survived. On the 4th of October, 1992, a man named Tevfik Esenk died in a village near the eastern coast of the Black Sea. He was in his 90s. He had outlived not only the people he had grown up with, but the world they had inhabited. His ancestors, the Ubik people, had been expelled from their homeland on the northeastern coast of the Black Sea in 1864. Forced into exile in what is now Turkey as part of the mass displacement of Circassian and related peoples following the Russo-Circassian War. Tevfik Esenk had been born in diaspora. He had lived his entire life carrying the language of a homeland he had never seen. When he died, the Ubik language died with him. He was the last fluent speaker. The Ubik language is notable in the history of linguistics for one feature that makes its loss particularly significant to anyone who thinks carefully about what languages actually are. It had 84 distinct consonant sounds. 84. English has approximately 24 consonant sounds. The language with the next largest consonant inventory in the documented record has around 80. Ubik was By this measure, the most phonologically complex language ever recorded by linguists. Those 84 consonants were not arbitrary complexity. They were distinctions that carried meaning. They allowed speakers to make fine-grained discriminations between concepts that a language with fewer consonants would have to express through phrases or simply could not express directly at all. When Tevfik Esenk took his last breath, that entire system of discrimination vanished. Not the recordings linguists had made of him. Those survive and researchers continue to work with them. But the living transmission, the chain from speaker to learner that had kept the language alive for however many thousands of years it had existed, was broken at that moment and has not been repaired since. Languages do not die alone. This is the point that takes a moment to absorb fully. A language is not just a system of sounds and grammar. A language is a way of organizing the world. It encodes, in its vocabulary and its structure, the accumulated observations of the community that developed it over thousands of years of living in a specific environment and attending to specific problems. A language developed in an Arctic environment may have a vocabulary for ice and snow conditions that allows its speakers to make distinctions unavailable in any other language. Not because Arctic people are more intelligent, but because they spent more time attending to ice and snow, and over generations developed finer-grained categories for what they observed. Those categories are knowledge. The distinctions they encode are real distinctions in the world that matter for the people who need to navigate that world. When that language is lost, those distinctions do not automatically transfer to any replacement language. Some can be translated at the cost of replacing a single word with a phrase. But others cannot be translated without loss, because the concept they encode does not exist as a concept in the receiving language. It can be described, approximately, but the ease and precision of the original expression is gone. Linguist K. David Harrison, whose work on endangered languages is among the most accessible to a general audience, has documented specific cases of ecological and botanical knowledge encoded in endangered languages that exists nowhere else in any recorded form. Communities in Siberia, in the Amazon, in the Pacific, have developed vocabularies for the plants, animals, weather patterns, and ecological relationships of their specific environments that represent accumulated knowledge refined over centuries of observation and practice. When the language dies, that knowledge loses its most natural form of expression. Harrison has written that the current rate of language loss represents a disappearance of accumulated human knowledge comparable in scale to the destruction of a major library. Though he notes carefully that this analogy is imprecise and that the losses are not uniform across all endangered languages, what it captures is the scale of what is at stake. Now consider the historical losses. The languages that were not simply neglected into extinction but actively suppressed by deliberate policy. In the residential school systems operated in Canada, the United States, and Australia through much of the 19th and 20th centuries, Indigenous children were removed from their communities and forbidden from speaking their native languages. The explicit goal of these systems, stated openly in policy documents of the period, was cultural assimilation. The linguistic component of that project was understood by its architects as essential. Language was where identity lived. Disrupt the language. Disrupt the transmission of everything the language carried. The knowledge losses that resulted were not accidental. They were intended. In specific communities, the interruption of transmission through these systems coincided with the deaths of elders who held knowledge that had not yet been passed on. The combination of forced separation and demographic loss created gaps in knowledge transmission that no subsequent effort has been able to fully repair. There are plants whose medicinal properties were known to specific communities and are now known only in fragmentary form. There are navigational techniques, ecological observations, ceremonial practices, and historical accounts that existed fully in human memory in 1900 and no longer exist in any complete form today. This is not ancient history. This happened within living memory in some communities. But the story of language loss is not only a story of destruction. In the 1960s, Hawaiian was spoken fluently by only a small number of people, almost all of them elderly. The language had been suppressed in schools for decades and associated in the minds of many younger Hawaiians with disadvantage rather than with cultural identity. Today, according to various estimates that researchers note are difficult to measure precisely, Hawaiian is spoken by tens of thousands of people, and the number is growing. There are immersion schools where children learn entirely in Hawaiian from kindergarten through high school. There is a Hawaiian language television channel. The language has been brought back from the edge of extinction through a sustained, deliberate, community-driven effort that began in the early 1980s and has continued for more than 4 decades. The Welsh language in Britain presents a comparable case. Actively suppressed in the 19th century through policies that punish children for speaking it in school, Welsh declined dramatically in the early 20th century. Today, according to recent census estimates, it is spoken by hundreds of thousands of people. Supported by Welsh medium education, a Welsh language television channel, and legal protections throughout Wales. The Maori language of New Zealand, severely threatened in the mid-20th century, has been revitalized through a network of language immersion preschools called Kohanga Rio that began operating in 1982. Maori is now an official language of New Zealand, and the revitalization effort is studied internationally as a model for endangered language recovery. What do these recoveries have in common? They were community-driven. They prioritized transmission to children, understanding that a language survives only when it is learned as a first language by a new generation. They created contexts in which the language was useful and valued in daily life, and they received sustained support over periods of decades. Not short-term interventions that faded before the results could consolidate. The recovery of Hawaiian and Welsh and Maori does not mean everything was saved. Knowledge lost during the periods of suppression was not fully recovered when the language came back. The language is a vessel. But if the contents were poured out before the vessel was repaired, repairing the vessel does not automatically restore the contents. What the recovery means is that the vessel is available again, that the transmission chain, broken for a generation or 2 or 3, can be reconnected, that the knowledge which survived in the memories of elders, in the work of linguists, in the ceremonial contexts that kept fragments alive, can now be transmitted to people who have the linguistic and cultural context to receive it fully. There is a concept in ecology called the extinction debt. It describes the phenomenon whereby a habitat reduced below a certain threshold will continue to lose species for decades after the damage, because the remaining species are living on borrowed time in a system that can no longer sustain them. The full consequences are not immediately visible. They accumulate and become apparent later. Language ecologists have applied the same concept to linguistic diversity. The suppressions of the 19th and 20th centuries created a linguistic extinction debt that we are still paying down. Languages whose last fluent speakers are alive but aging. Languages whose transmission to the next generation was interrupted a generation ago. Languages being held in the memories of elders who are not yet gone, but whose knowledge has not yet been fully documented or passed on. The debt comes due when those elders die. And the payment is knowledge, irreplaceable, specific, accumulated over thousands of years of human attention to specific corners of the world, lost in a single morning. The way Ubik was lost on the 4th of October, 1992, in a village near the Black Sea, when an old man took his last breath and 84 consonants stopped existing in the mouth of any living person. The silence after that is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of a library whose last reader has left the building, and whose doors, in some cases, can still be opened. If we move quickly enough, but if individual languages can disappear this completely, finally, what does that tell us about the thing that all languages share? What is the thread that runs beneath every tongue that has ever been spoken, whether it survives tonight or not? That is the question the next chapter will try to follow down to wherever it leads. Chapter 10. The language. Underneath the language. There is a word that appears, in recognizably similar form, in languages spoken on opposite sides of the planet. The word means mother. In Latin, it is mater. In Sanskrit, it is mata. In ancient Greek, it is meter. In Russian, it is mat. In Welsh, it is mam. In Mandarin Chinese, it is ma. Across many languages, from entirely different families, words for mother tend to begin with a nasal consonant, often m, followed by an open vowel. A linguist will immediately point out that this observation requires careful handling. Latin, Sanskrit, Greek, Russian, and Welsh all belong to the Indo-European language family, and their similar words for mother descend from a single, reconstructed ancestral form. The similarity among those languages on this word is evidence of common descent within a family, not evidence of a deeper universal pattern. But Mandarin does not belong to the Indo-European family, and the cross-linguistic tendency toward nasal consonants in words for mother has been noted by researchers studying what is called sound symbolism. The linguist Roman Jakobson proposed in the 1960s that this pattern might reflect something about the sounds an infant produces while nursing, and that the association between those sounds and the person associated with nursing may have arisen independently in many language communities for the same biological reason. This is a hypothesis, not a proven fact. It has been debated in the linguistics literature for decades without reaching consensus. But it illustrates the kind of question that sits at the center of this chapter. Are there aspects of human language that are not culturally arbitrary, that reflect something shared across all language communities? And if so, what does that tell us about the deep history of language itself? To approach this honestly, we need to be clear about what linguistics actually knows about language history, and where the limits of that knowledge lie. The comparative method in linguistics allows researchers to reconstruct ancestral languages by comparing their descendants. When you see regular patterns of sound correspondence across related languages, you can work backward to reconstruct the sounds of the ancestral form. This method is well established and has produced detailed reconstructions of several ancestral languages. Most famously, Proto-Indo-European, the reconstructed ancestor of the family that includes English, Hindi, Russian, Greek, Latin, and dozens of others. Proto-Indo-European is estimated to have been spoken somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 years ago, probably in the region north of the Black Sea, though the precise location and timing are still debated. Its reconstruction is one of the most impressive achievements of historical linguistics. The same method has been applied to other families. Proto-Afro-Asiatic, the ancestor of Arabic, Hebrew, and ancient Egyptian, among others. Proto-Austronesian, the ancestor of the languages spoken across a vast arc from Madagascar to Hawaii to New Zealand. The family whose speakers accomplished the Pacific navigations we discussed earlier in this story. Each reconstruction takes us back several thousand years at most. The question that sits beyond all of them is whether it is possible, in principle, to go further, to find traces of language that predates the divergence of the major families, to hear, however faintly, what human language might have sounded like before the migrations out of Africa dispersed our ancestors across the planet tens of thousands of years ago. This is the domain of what researchers call long-range comparison, or macro-family linguistics, and it is one of the most contested areas in the entire field. the researcher most associated with the idea of a single ancestral human language, sometimes called proto-world or proto-human, is Merritt Ruhlen, who spent much of his career at Stanford developing and defending the proposal that all human languages descend from a single ancestral tongue. Ruhlen assembled what he argued were related words across languages from unrelated families, arguing that the patterns of similarity were too systematic to be explained by chance. The mainstream linguistics community has been deeply skeptical of these specific claims. The comparative method depends on having many related languages to compare, each preserving different aspects of the ancestral system. Working backward to a language spoken more than 50,000 years ago pushes the method far beyond the time depth where it produces reliable results. After 50,000 years of change, virtually no direct traces of vocabulary or grammar would be expected to survive because the rate of linguistic change would have erased them. Prominent critics, including Lyle Campbell and Donald Ringe, have maintained that the similarities Ruhlen identifies are too few and too susceptible to chance resemblance to support his conclusions. The linguistics mainstream leans strongly against proto-world as a recoverable object, though discussion of the idea has not entirely disappeared from the literature. Pause here for a moment. You have been following a long thread tonight. From tattoos on a glacier man's skin, to knots in Andean string, to songs that encode a continent, to stories that may remember coastlines swallowed 10,000 years ago. It is a lot to hold. Let it settle. The thread continues. But it goes somewhere quieter now. There is a separate question alongside the proto-world debate that does not depend on its resolution. Not whether all languages descend from a single identifiable ancestor, but whether all human languages share structural features reflecting not common descent but common biology. This is the domain of universal grammar, the framework most closely associated with Noam Chomsky. Chomsky's proposal, developed beginning in the late 1950s and revised and updated significantly many times over the following decades, as new evidence and new theoretical challenges emerged, was that human beings are born with an innate capacity for language that makes it possible for children to acquire grammatical structures from the imperfect input they receive from the speakers around them. It is worth noting that Chomsky's own formulations of what that innate capacity consists of have changed considerably over the years, and the framework continues to evolve in response to ongoing research. The prediction is that all human languages, whatever their surface differences, should share certain deep structural properties reflecting that underlying biology. Some candidate universals have held up reasonably well. All human languages have ways of forming questions. All have ways of negating propositions. All make distinctions between specific individuals and general categories. Other proposed universals have been challenged. The Amazonian language Piraha, studied by linguist Daniel Everett, has been claimed to lack certain features previously considered universal, including the grammatical property of embedding clauses within clauses. Those claims have been disputed by other researchers. The debate continues, and the honest summary is that the specific content of linguistic universals remains contested, even if the existence of some universal tendencies seems well supported. What does this mean for the questions we have been exploring? It means that the similarities we observe across widely separated languages and knowledge systems are probably explained not by a single common source in the historical past, but by a common source in human biology and cognition. The human brain, wherever it developed and whatever language it was shaped by, tends to organize experience in certain ways, tends to reach for certain kinds of distinctions, tends to find certain forms of expression more natural than others. That shared cognitive architecture is the deepest language we have. Not a language spoken by a lost civilization. Not a code hidden in ancient symbols. But the architecture of human thought itself, present in every language and every knowledge system we have visited across the course of this night. The spiral in France and the spiral in Hawaii do not need to share a common source to tell us something profound. They share a maker, A human being with a human brain, finding in a particular shape, a particular resonance, with something the brain generates reliably. Everywhere on Earth, in every era we have any record of. The flood stories told on opposite sides of the planet do not need to all remember the same flood to reveal something true. They share a maker who found in the experience of catastrophic loss a particular narrative shape. The world before, the world after, the thin thread of survival connecting them. The songlines and the quipus and the oral traditions of the griots are not expressions of a single lost knowledge system handed down from a forgotten source. They are expressions of a single capacity, the human capacity to take experience and shape it into something that can be transmitted, something that can outlast the moment of its making, something that can reach across the distance between one mind and another and arrive with enough of its original content intact to matter. That capacity is what language is, not the specific sounds or symbols or knots or gestures that any particular culture has used to express it. The capacity itself, the drive to make meaning and share it, the refusal to let what is known die with the person who knows it. That is the language underneath every language. Older than any writing system, older than any alphabet, older than any proto-language that any method of reconstruction can reach. It is as old as we are. And in every tradition we have visited tonight, we have been watching that same capacity express itself in the forms that the specific conditions of each community made possible. Different forms, same language, the one underneath, the one that has no name because it was there before naming began. Chapter 11. The silence is still speaking. There is a tablet in a museum in Rome. It is a piece of wood, approximately 30 centimeters long. Its surface covered in tiny carved figures, human shapes with raised arms, fish and birds in geometric forms, lines of marks running carefully across the polished surface. The carving is precise and deliberate. Someone spent a long time making this, pressing each small figure into the wood with an obsidian flake or a shark tooth, in a room on an island in the southeastern Pacific, more than 3,000 kilometers from the nearest populated land. The people who lived on that island called it Rapa Nui, and at some point in their history they developed a script, often described by researchers as one of the few possible independently developed writing systems in human history. Though the precise nature and origins of the script are still discussed and debated in the scholarly literature, they called it Rongorongo. The last people who could read it died in the 1870s and 1880s. In the aftermath of Peruvian slave raids in 1862, that carried away a third to half of the island's population, including virtually every trained reader. What survived is fewer than 30 tablets, scattered across museums in Rome, London, Washington, Vienna, St. Petersburg, and Santiago. Approximately 15,000 legible glyphs on roughly 24 pieces of wood, still unread. After more than a century and a half of effort by some of the most capable linguists and cryptographers in the world, Rongorongo is not the only voice that has not yet spoken to us. Linear A, the undeciphered script of the Minoan civilization of ancient Crete, survives in approximately 1,400 inscriptions. Researchers can sound out the words using phonetic values borrowed from the later Greek-adapted script called Linear B. But the language underneath is not Greek, not Egyptian, not any tongue anyone has been able to match it to. The words can be pronounced. They cannot be understood. The Indus script, used by the Harappan civilization of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India between roughly 2600 and 1900 BCE, survives on more than 4,000 inscribed objects, approximately 400 distinct signs. Most inscriptions fewer than 5 signs long. No bilingual text has ever been found to serve as an anchor. More than a century of attempted decipherment. No solution accepted by the broader scholarly community. 3 separate voices. 3 separate civilizations. Each developed a system for encoding language in a permanent medium. Each fell silent before that system could be passed to anyone who survived to teach it forward. They are the most visible silences in the human record. The places where we can see clearly that something was being said and cannot yet hear what it was. But the tools available for working on those silences are better now than they have ever been. Machine learning approaches have been applied to undeciphered scripts, analyzing statistical patterns in the distribution of signs to generate hypotheses about relationships between unknown scripts and known languages. These approaches have not yet produced a decipherment of any major undeciphered script, but they are generating specific hypotheses that human analysts can then test with traditional methods, narrowing the space of what the answers could be in ways that human analysis alone could not achieve in a reasonable time frame. LiDAR surveys, using laser pulses fired from aircraft to map ground surfaces beneath forest canopy, have in the past decade revealed urban landscapes hidden under jungle that were entirely unknown to archaeology. A survey of the lowland Maya region in Guatemala reported the identification of thousands of previously unrecorded structures, rewriting the understanding of classic Maya civilization's scale and complexity. In the Amazon, surveys published in the journal Science in January of 2024, led by archaeologist Stephen Rostaing of France's National Center for Scientific Research, revealed a network of interconnected urban settlements more than 2,500 years old, spanning over 300 kilometers. Each of these discoveries adds to the map of what we did not know existed and makes the known record look more and more like a small sample of something much larger. And in the North Sea, off the coasts of Britain and the Netherlands and Denmark, a research program led by Professor Vince Gaffney of the University of Bradford has been using seismic data to reconstruct the landscape of a drowned world that connected Britain to continental Europe until rising seas swallowed it after the end of the last ice age. Researchers are now applying artificial intelligence to scan that data for signatures of ancient human settlement buried beneath the seafloor sediment. If the technology succeeds, it will open an archive of the human past that has been sealed for 8,000 years. All of these tools are expressions of the same impulse we have been tracing through this entire night: the refusal to accept silence as the final word. The same impulse that made communities in prehistoric Australia embed geological memory in a song and maintain that song through hundreds of generations. The same impulse that made Polynesian navigators memorize the rising points of hundreds of stars and carry that knowledge across thousands of miles of open ocean. The same impulse that made whoever carved those tablets on Rapa Nui spend hours pressing tiny glyphs into wood, encoding something they believed was worth preserving. We are the inheritors of that impulse. And the record we are slowly recovering is not the record of a simpler humanity struggling toward the achievements of the present. It is the record of a species that has always understood, at some level below the fully articulate, that what is known must not be lost, that the person on the other side of the transmission, the person who will receive what you manage to pass on, matters, even if you will never meet them, even if they will not be born for 1,000 years, even if they will be standing in a laboratory looking at a piece of wood from an island they have never visited, trying to hear what it is saying. Ruth Shady Solis is still working at Carroll, the oldest city in the Americas, opening new sections of a site that flourished and was then forgotten for more than 4,000 years. She knelt in the dust of the Supe Valley in 1994 and began to understand what she was looking at. 30 years later, she is still there, still listening to what the ground has to say. Sabine Hyland is still counting knots on Andean string, still following the thread that the package of photographs placed in her hands in 2017, still asking what the people who made those quipus were trying to preserve in the tension and the color and the precise placement of each knot. Both of them are doing what human beings have always done, refusing to let the silence be the final word, reaching back across the distance to hear something that was said before anyone found a way to write it down. And somewhere above you tonight, If the sky is clear where you are. The stars have not changed in any way. Most human eyes would notice from the positions they occupied when the people of Nabta Playa arranged their stones to mark the solstice. The same stars the Polynesian navigators memorized and used to cross an ocean the size of a hemisphere. The same stars woven into songs that carried ecological knowledge across 10,000 years of human memory. And the questions those stars were used to answer are the same questions human beings were asking when they first looked up at them, long before the first word was ever pressed into clay. Where are we? What is coming? How do we keep from losing what we know? The silence is not empty. It never was. It is full of what was said before anyone found a way to write it down. And some of it, carefully looked for, patiently listened to, by the people who have devoted their lives to the listening, is still speaking tonight. Let your breathing slow now. The past is patient. It has been waiting a very long time, and it will still be there tomorrow. Held in the ground, and the stars, and the songs that people are still singing tonight in languages that most of the world does not know exist. You do not need to hold on to anything. Just let the quiet carry you. Sleep well. Dream of what was said. Good night.